in Paul Rogers, who is an emeritus professor of peace studies at the University of Bradford. Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for your time. Let's just pick up then on this story that's emanating out of Israel, the potential of forced displacement of Gazans the day after the conflict ends. And we know that the statements have been made by extreme right elements of the Israeli government. I mean, in your assessment, is this only those people like Itamar Ben-gvir, or is this a view widely shared by the rest of the Israeli government?
I think it's primarily those people who support the parties within the Knesset who take this kind of view. It is worth remembering that in the early days after the war started, after the 7th of October, there were quite a few messages coming out from the Israeli government that this would be the long-term aim. There were elements within the government who wanted to see this in the long term. Now it's coming through to the front in a way that I think people are really surprised. People have forgotten what was already being said. It is not the whole Israeli government. It's certainly not Israeli people as a whole, but it is still an important group. And the most important thing is that these are the people within Netanyahu's government who hold the balance of power. And this is what makes this so unusual. The Netanyahu government overall is certainly a very hardline government, but this takes them even further in an extreme direction. And the real problem is that this could become a kind of fait accompli if the international community isn't alert to this. You're absolutely right to say that Biden himself has said this is not going to be on the agenda. The United States will be against it. But one has to be careful here because we're in very strange times. You were hearing earlier on about all the problems there are in Gaza, the collapse of the health service, all the problems of water and food and basically medical supplies. And that means that you are getting a population which is really very hard pushed. And the fear is that at some stage there will be an encouragement for them to move overseas. People in Gaza do not want to do that remotely because it is their land. But the worry is that this is going to develop really quite rapidly. That I think is the change in mood which we've seen with these feelers coming out from the far-right elements within the Israeli government. And it's going to be really critical to see what happens in the next few days, whether that idea, whether that thinking is batted down in favor of a more fair solution.
Yeah, well, we know that the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken's on his way to the Middle East, not only to discuss the forced relocation of Gazans, but also the concerns of the conflict spreading throughout the territory. We've seen much support in Lebanon for the assassinated Hamas leader, presumably at Israeli hands. How much support, though, does Hamas have in Lebanon? And what reaction, if any, do you expect from Hezbollah following that assassination?
That, I think, is a key question. It's not an easy one to answer because in some ways, both the United States on the one hand and Iran on the other hand do not want to see a huge escalation of the war in the north. And because of that, I think in some ways Hezbollah will be held back, surprisingly, by the Iranians. You can't be sure about this, and we're in very unpredictable times, let me put it that way. But at the moment, it does seem that Hezbollah is holding back. The Israelis are certainly doing their strikes. Hezbollah is actually firing a fair number of rockets as well, but it is not escalating some to a real new height. And I think one of the problems is that if that opened as a new front, then right from the start, the reaction in Israel would be to go in very deeply and very big with strike aircraft. And that could be damage. If you go back to 2006, the last time this kind of interchange happened, then the damage done to the Lebanese infrastructure, the economic infrastructure of the state was severe. And obviously the Lebanese government does not want to have that happen again. So I know it's a long answer, but I think it's not certain by any stretch that Hezbollah will actually come out in the open in full support for Hamas. But of course, what is happening in Gaza is so difficult, particularly for the people in Gaza, that may change. As I say, very difficult to predict. And basically what we want is a much greater move towards a rational settlement which treats the people with the decency they deserve.
Well, let's finish this conversation on Gaza itself and the Israeli military offensive there. Back in October, you predicted that their ground offensive would fail and it would only further galvanize Hamas and a new generation of people wanting to fight for their cause. I mean, how do you assess the current situation? Has Israel made any significant progress on that front?
Well, put it this way, it's made huge progress in damaging Gaza itself. You have very large parts of the whole territory which are now uninhabitable, and there's been massive damage to the infrastructure. As far as Hamas is concerned, it still seems to have a capability to carry on for a long time. And essentially, Israel really had to defeat it very quickly if it was going to achieve its aims. But it doesn't seem to be doing that. But the other side is something you just touched on, is one of the real issue here is tens of thousands of young people, mainly but not only men, Gazans, who've experienced this, who will be massively radicalized. The extraordinary thing is that with all Israel's military power, with all its capability, one always has to remember this 7th of October was a heck of a shock to the Israeli people. We should never forget that. But the result of that is that they will go very far in what they're trying to do now. And in a sense, I think the effect will be apparently knocking back Hamas in the short term. But I fear, like many people, that this was in some ways a trap set by Hamas. And the end result will be, if anything, less security for the state of Israel. There will be so many thousands of young people who are absolutely angered all to an extreme about what's happening. And of course, you have the higher pressures on the West Bank as well. So I'm afraid to say that I think the future is very gloomy, including for Israel's own security.
Paul, it's great to talk to you today. We really appreciate you coming on the News Hour for us. Paul Rogers there from Bradford University.